Welcome to Module 4. It's all about prototyping. Before we get started, let's talk about what is a prototype, why you need a prototype, and how to make that prototype. Okay, so what is a prototype? A prototype is a physical representation of what your product is. It's the first version, okay? So if you're making a pair of safety glasses, the first pair would be considered the prototype. And you may have multiple prototypes. Now, the main reason for needing a prototype may or may not be what you think, okay? If your product is mechanical, say it's one piece, it's very simple, then why you need a prototype is mainly for sales and marketing. If your product is more complex, like it has moving parts, maybe it has electronics, maybe it has smart features and it connects to software that connects to the internet, then you need to build prototypes to demonstrate the functionality before you get to sales and marketing types of prototypes, which are called pre-production. Okay, so now that you understand what a prototype is and why you need a prototype, let's talk about how to go about building your prototype. Now, prototype building depends on many factors. Is your product big or is it small? Big meaning a foot or larger, small meaning a foot or less, 12 inches or less. If your product is small, prototyping is going to be relatively inexpensive, okay? If your product is large, prototyping is going to be much more expensive. But we'll go over how to mitigate those costs. First, let's go over the different prototype types in more detail, okay? Let's start with the functional prototype, okay? A functional prototype demonstrates the functionality or even one aspect of the functionality of a product. You can either choose to build one prototype that demonstrates all the functionality, or you could build multiple prototypes that test certain aspects of the functionality. So let's use the electric floor scrubber as an example that we've been using in all the past modules, okay? If I was gonna prototype the electric floor scrubber, the first thing I would do is prototype the electronics and the motor that drives the floor scrubbing attachment, okay? I would measure and test the cleaning performance of that floor scrubber attachment. And I'd worry about the handle and everything else much later. I want to make sure that I get the core functionality of that prototype right first before I move on to building out the other aspects of the prototype. If I was building a smart device, maybe if I was building another smart device or embedded product, I would build out the electronics, not necessarily the custom designed printed circuit board that you might have later for production, but at least all the components, prototyped, breadboarded, wire wrapped, however, in your prototype, so that you can finalize and develop code against it to show the functionality and test the functionality of your prototype, okay? It's all about functionality. If it was mechanical and you had, your product had a wheel, maybe you're designing a new type of wheelbarrow and the critical component is the new wheel that you've designed. Well, you don't have to build the whole wheelbarrow to test the wheel, so you would build the prototype of your wheel, test it out, and then when you're happy with the performance of the wheel, you would go ahead and build the rest of the wheelbarrow, okay? So functional prototypes are designed to validate your design's functional performance. And I would start with the main critical aspects of the functionality first before I moved on to the rest of the product, okay? So to recap, if you were making a product with electronics in it, and the electronics were the smarts of the product, I wouldn't even worry about the enclosure, okay? I would do the enclosure last, because what's important is the electronics and the firmware and the power management and the connectivity to Bluetooth or to the internet that you need for that product to work. Once you've made your functional prototype or multiple functional prototypes, it's time to make the pre-production, or also known as the pre-sales prototype. Now, this prototype is all about showing the customer exactly how it's going to look in addition to how it's going to behave. Without the pre-sales or the pre-manufacturing prototype, locking in sales and pre-orders and crowdfunding campaigns will be difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult. A pre-production prototype allows you to go directly to retailers, to distributors, go to trade shows, and show off your product, exactly how it looks, how it weighs, how it's going to behave, so that distributors and retailers can go ahead and place orders with you and give you money to start for manufacturing that product today. Okay? But without the prototype, without a solid prototype, that's not going to happen. Now, let's talk more about building the prototype. Okay? Building the prototype really depends on your budget. Okay? The worst thing you could do is say, I can't do anything about building this prototype. I don't have the money, or I don't have the expertise, or whatever the case may be. Okay. At Leskey Innovations, we build prototypes. We build prototypes for just about every client project we take on, because who's better to build and build your product than the engineers that designed it, right? But let's talk about your budget for your prototype. If budget is an issue, then I would build the minimum viable prototype needed. So it doesn't have to look pretty, okay? It has to be functional. You have to demonstrate the functionality. So if you're bootstrapping a new product, and its electronics are the main component of it. Electronics and software are the main components of it. Then I would get all the electronics squared away, make sure it worked, absolutely worked, because that's the core of it. And then for the enclosure, version 1 could be like an enclosure that you buy off the shelf, like from Polycase or something, and maybe you modify that. Maybe you're repurposing some other containers. Maybe you're building a custom enclosure from parts that you're getting from Home Depot. Maybe, and I've seen this done lots of times, maybe you just build your enclosure out of Legos, because that's what Legos were made for to begin with. You build it all out Legos, you put your electronics inside, and then when you do your marketing campaign, like your Kickstarter or your Indiegogo for crowdfunding, then what you can do is you can say, you can say, here's the product, here's what it does, here's the new enclosure design that you'll get when you order the product. But part of raising money in this campaign is to afford the manufacturing of that new enclosure, because we've done everything else, we just can't afford that enclosure. Okay, you can't go off and do it right now as soon as you've got that prototype, as soon as you've gotten this far. There's a process to crowdfunding, there's a process to Kickstarter. We'll cover that in the next set of modules after you've built your prototype and you've gotten it to work 100%. Okay. Now, if your product is more simplistic, okay, then you should build a prototype mainly for sales and marketing use. You may tweak stuff along the way, but if your product is small, prototypes aren't going to cost that much. If your product is large, okay, and you're on a shoestring budget, then there's a lot of sources of do-it-yourself information out there that'll be very valuable, okay? For example, if you need to build a big plastic part, then I would look into DIY vacuum forming. Okay, vacuum forming is relatively easy. Lots of people are able to do it themselves at home. We have a vacuum forming capability at Letsky Innovations that we use to help clients build their products. Vacuum forming consists of making a pattern, melting plastic, and forming the plastic to the pattern. Relatively cheap compared to other types of manufacturing processes for large items. Okay. 3D printing. Look, 3D printing for large items is expensive, and 3D prints don't hold up well for sales and marketing activities where people have to test the functionality or they want to drop it to see if it breaks in the box. If your product is small, under a foot, then 3D printing probably fine, because you can build a lot of 3D prints pretty cost effectively, and then you can coat them to make them harder and simulate more of your form and feel, form, fit, and feel. CNC machining is another way to build parts for your prototype. I would shop around for different costs of CNC vendors. Again, machine parts that are small or aren't complex don't take a lot of time to machine, so they're going to be relatively inexpensive. Larger parts have more material cost, and if they're complex parts, they have higher machine time, which is going to make them more expensive to manufacture. At Letsky Innovations, we have a 4-foot by 4-foot CNC router that we can process most materials on relatively quickly, and for our clients, very cost effectively. So if you need help making parts for your prototype, hey, just send us an email at info@letskyinnovations.com and we'll be happy to help you. Another aspect to develop mechanical components of your prototype is called cast urethane. If you like working with hazardous chemicals, then you can look for cast urethane kits, and it involves making a pattern, pouring typically a silicone mold, making silicone tooling from that pattern, and then pouring cast urethane that represents the type of plastic you would use in production into that mold, letting it cure, and getting finished parts out. But if you're uncomfortable with mixing chemicals by weight, hazardous chemicals by weight, then maybe that's not something that you want to do at home. Okay. Let's talk about prototyping electrical components and why you absolutely have to prototype electronics. Okay. For electronics, no software in the world is going to account for all the noise in an electrical system. Okay, you can get close, but the manufacturing process for integrated circuits has variance in it. And so every batch has a slightly different electrical property that you're just not going to account for in the software. So you need to build a functional prototype of all your electrical components when, okay, you're building a smart product and it's mostly electronics and firmware, okay, because you can't account for all the noise, okay. As a matter of fact, any product that has electronics in it, you have to build a prototype to make sure the circuits actually work and that they're going to work reliably and safe for your customers at the end of the day. Mechanical parts, you know, like enclosures, plastic enclosures that come together. If your engineering team, like the awesome engineering team at Leskey Innovations, has gone ahead and designed in a reputable CAD software like SolidWorks, then what the engineering team can do is they can virtually prototype it in the CAD software, do form and fit verification, do analysis for impact testing, drop testing, fatigue testing, all the different types of analysis that you would need for product development to make sure it's a good product. Like, you wouldn't have to build a prototype, drop it off the roof of your house, and then build another prototype and run it over by your car, all right, in order to test the impact strength or the robustness of your product. You could do all that testing in the software, be highly confident in that level of testing, and go for those mechanical parts. Most of it, if they're not moving parts, then most of the time you can just go straight to building that prototype or those prototype parts for pre-production, for sales marketing, the finished part of it, okay? But if it's electrical, you absolutely have to build a prototype. You don't have to have the entire printed circuit board worked out. You can buy modules, put them together, and write your code against that. And then when you design the PCB, or have someone else like Leskey Innovations design your PCB for you, you just tell them the modules you used, you have all the firmware developed. And what we would do is we would source the similar modules or compatible modules, put them on a printed circuit board, get it ready for production, use the firmware that you've already written, saves on development time, and make sure everything is finalized and tested for your production runs. Okay. So now we've discussed what is a prototype, okay? A prototype is the first version of your product. There are two types of prototypes, functional and pre-production. Functional prototypes don't have to look like your product at all, but they have to test the core functionality of your product, okay? And you can do it as an entire product, or you can do it as parts of your product at a time, and then do it as your entire product. Pre-production prototypes is what you're going to use in sales and marketing. And you have to get to pre-production prototype to have an effective sales and marketing campaign, from anything to crowdfunding, to trade shows, to retail and distribution, okay? And we've covered how to build your prototype. You know, if you're on a budget, you may want to look into doing some of the things yourself, or repurposing some materials. But hope is not all lost for crowdfunding, okay? And if your product is small, right, prototyping is going to be more cost efficient. Okay, it's not going to cost you very much to get the prototypes made, because in prototypes, size does matter. Alright, so that concludes the end of this video. If you have any questions about prototyping, please email us at info@letskeyinnovations.com. If you like these videos and you found them useful, and you have friends that can benefit from this lesson, please tell a friend about our course. You'd be helping them out. You'd be helping them save thousands of dollars on developing their products. And you'd be helping me out too.